Hello, everyone. My name is Jessica Nielsen. I'm the president and founder of the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota, and we're about to do a deep dive into what's going on in the psychedelic space. There's a lot going on in terms of drug policy reform, FDA decisions on new drugs coming through the pipeline that people were excited about, efforts in different states to try to legalize psychedelic medicines, and other things happening locally that I want to make people aware of, and just do a little bit of some public education around psychedelic medicines so that people are informed and understand what's going on, what are some of the legal realities, what's the status of the science. And I can give you some updates about the Psychedelic Medicine Task Force here in Minnesota. I'm the chairperson of the Psychedelic Medicine Task Force. I was appointed by Governor Walz to serve on the task force as somebody with experience giving people psychedelic medicines in kind of a clinical context, given my prior work as a principal investigator and assistant professor at the University of Minnesota doing the first psilocybin clinical trial there. And then I was elected by the other members to chair the task force, given my experience both in the community as well as a researcher in this space. So I can give you some updates on that while speaking just for myself and kind of my thoughts and observations of the task force, and not necessarily speaking for the task force. So all of the opinions that I'm going to share reflect sort of my own position on some of these things, while trying to give you a bit of a thorough rundown of kind of what's going on, and hopefully you all can have an informed decision on how you want to engage with psychedelics and the psychedelic community. So yeah, stay tuned and strap in, because we're going to do a deep dive into some really cool topics related to the psychedelic space. All right, so now we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into the neuroscience of psychedelics. So, what this means is sort of how do psychedelics impact the brain? So, I have a little bit of knowledge to speak on this. So, I've been doing psychedelics since I was 15 years old. I don't do them that much anymore, but I've have a very long standing history of using psychedelics, so they know them very well, experientially and personally. And I also have a PhD in neuroscience, and so I know how the brain works, and I've been merging those two sort of fields of training. One was sort of self-taught through my experiential knowledge of psychedelics, and the other was sort of through academia and sort of learning the ropes of neuroscience and the tools needed to understand how to study how the brain works. And seeing how powerful psychedelics are in helping us kind of probe the brain and look at the profound changes that it causes, and how that can help us understand not only how the brain works, but how it can help the brain heal from different things. So I kind of want to cover a few different things, and again, want to keep it really simple for folks. You know, this isn't a scientific lecture. I really want this to be accessible to non-scientists or non-psychonauts. But I want to cover sort of like, what do psychedelics do to the brain based on what we know? Why do we even have these experiences to begin with? And what potentially can be done with psychedelics to really help us move towards a state of wellness or a spiritual connection, or something else. Like they're very good at helping the brain change, and that's why people are so interested in them, to potentially help treat these really chronic treatment-resistant mental health conditions, because they really do change the way the brain works. But that isn't always necessarily a good thing. And I know a lot of people are kind of throwing around this buzzword called neuroplasticity, and that's basically just the brain's ability to change. It happens all the time. It happens when you learn something new. It happens when you're exposed to something novel. And it happens when you exercise, and it also happens when you take psychedelics. So I do just kind of want to give a brief rundown of some of those concepts. So basically what psychedelics are doing is they're primarily acting through receptors in the brain that respond to something called serotonin. So this isn't every single psychedelic that you're hearing about, but most of the classic, psychedelics like LSD and magic mushrooms that contain psilocybin and psilocin dimethyltryptamine. All of these really kind of exert their kind of main mechanisms of action through these serotonin receptors. And so it's one of the main neurotransmitters in your brain. And so these are molecules that help different cells in the brain communicate with each other so the brain can function and do different things that we need, to interact with other people and do basic tasks and things like that and have our bodies work. So it's kind of interesting to think about what is the purpose of psychedelics, because psychedelics seem to consistently induce these experiences of a very spiritual or mystical content or themes, or, people will have these death-like experiences. A lot of people will call it an ego death. And what we now know is that one of the most potent psychedelics that people will take, dimethyltryptamine or DMT, this is one of those ingredients in ayahuasca, not to be confused with 5-MeO-DMT from the Sonoran Desert Toad. That's a different type of DMT. The type of DMT that's in your brain, I think, is more of an NN-DMT, and it's released when we die. Fun fact, and basically we're all holding in terms of having a controlled substance in our brain. So dimethyltryptamine is a Schedule 1 drug. I'll get into what that means in a minute, but it basically means that it's the most illegal, and we all have it in our brain. So we're all possessing a Schedule 1 substance at all times. But it's interesting to think about, why do we have the ability to have these types of big experiences? It's not really understood evolutionarily why we have these experiences. I think we know in certain plants they have these compounds in them to ward off predators, as sort of like a natural pest control. Whereas we have these experiences that seem to be very unique in their sort of mystical, spiritual nature, at least from my perspective. And I think that's not surprising, given that they've been revered for thousands of years by indigenous communities as a religious sacrament. So we have, peyote with Native Americans, and magic mushrooms and all over the world, but most notably in parts of Mexico, popularized by Maria Sabina. There's iboga in West Africa. There's ayahuasca in South America. There's amanita in kind of the more Nordic regions of the world. So all of these things, it's kind of interesting to think about, with the exception of amanita, which doesn't involve all the serotonin I mentioned. It's a different one, but it is kind of one of the old school psychedelics when you think of all the lore around psychedelics. And that, we have these experiences that are mystical in nature, and it's released when we die. And so some people have coined dimethyltryptamine or DMT as the spirit molecule. There's a book about this, written by Rick Strassman, who's a medical doctor in New Mexico who gave DMT to people in the 90s after a long break from the research, and kind of wrote about all the different really interesting experiences that people have. And there's interesting science around kind of, where does DMT come from? A lot of people thought it was produced in the pineal gland. I think that's been debunked. It most likely comes from some other source in the brain that I won't get into. But we do know, it has been confirmed, that it is released when you die. And there's a theory that it's also produced during fetal development, around 49 days after conception. And I think this correlates to something in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, around a certain amount of time after conception, that the soul enters the body. And so just really interesting to think about. Whether that's true or not, I don't think science can empirically prove, whether this is actually a spirit molecule. But if you look at, reports of near-death experiences, there's a lot of consistencies there. So I just think it's fascinating. And I think it really helps explain why people have these profound mystical or spiritual experiences on these psychedelics, kind of given this predisposition we have to basically be tripping while we're dying. And so that's one piece of it. The other piece is the fact that through all of this activity, say somebody has one of these big experiences, it's been shown now in animal research that psychedelic experiences can open what's called a critical period of development. And this gets back to this term I was talking about before, neuroplasticity. And so the critical period of development is a part of all of us go through it up to the age of 5 years old, where the brain is like a sponge and it just is really good at learning and adapting to new things because it's just getting used to this sort of new world and all these sensory things going on, and there's so much information to process, and the brain's just taking it all in and trying to figure out, what do I need to hardwire, what's irrelevant, what should I maybe gauge a little bit so I can only let some of it in at a time. So all of that is kind of happening as you develop, and it's highly dependent on what you're exposed to and what you actually prime the system with to learn and change and kind of develop in this critical period. And what animal studies are showing now is that psychedelics and even things like MDMA and ketamine are able to reopen this sort of critical period of development. And that's potentially why the brain is so malleable and able to get out of these kind of really deeply ingrained stuck behaviors, because the brain is now able to kind of crack the code open and change things and hopefully make it work a little bit different. And that's great, but we don't fully understand the full scope of how long does it last. There's some thoughts that the longer the drug experience, the longer time afterwards that critical period is open. So if you're having a 16-hour LSD trip, you're going to have a lot more time in the days and weeks to follow than a 5-minute DMT smoked trip, for example. So I think that's kind of what the science is leaning towards. It hasn't been shown in humans yet, but it's really interesting to think about because there's a lot of people that are talking now about this term called integration. And that's really kind of a catch-all term to really say that after you have one of these experiences, your brain's in this malleable state, and that's the opportunity for you to start working on what you want to change. And it takes work. It takes daily practice. It takes consistency and dedication to really hardwire or unwire something that you want to change. So I liken it to like trying to learn how to play the piano. Like you can take your lessons and look at all the musical notes and kind of understand the theory of all of it. And you get that kind of one-on-one dedicated learning with the piano instructor, but it's up to you to go home and practice and make sure you can play those songs and you understand how to read the notes, and you got to do your homework before you come back for your next learning session, so I see a lot of parallels there with psychedelics, especially since we're talking about learning new things and critical periods of development and neuroplasticity, and all of that is kind of tied together, and making the brain be able to be in an optimal setting so it can change for the better. That being said, change could also happen in a bad way. There are things that are called maladaptive plasticity. So these would be things like addiction, avoidant behaviors, pain is another one. And, so we have to be really careful about what we do in that critical period of development, in that sort of integration phase, that neuroplasticity window that's opened. It's a great opportunity to change, but you could kind of reinforce something bad. We do talk a lot about this ego death concept, but it also could be ego inflating. So it really just kind of depends. It's very subjective and personal and, different for every person. But I will say that just from my own standpoint, getting back to kind of the spiritual nature of these things, I used to be an atheist before I had my first big mystical experience on psychedelics, and I am no longer an atheist because I felt like I was able to get a glimpse of what some people would call ultimate reality. The scientist in me kind of turns my nose up at that concept, but there's something about being in that state, that peak psychedelic experience, that just feels more natural and aligned with like your higher purpose, and everything just makes sense, and you just feel like everything seems possible. And it's really interesting to get a window into that. And yeah, I don't know, it's a whole nother conversation. So I just kind of want give a shout out to the fact that they are very, very beautiful experiences. And I just feel like with my own spiritual practice and like this notion of the ego death and the fact that we know that, DMT might be a spirit molecule and we're kind of tripping as we go out the door, that these psychedelic experiences, when we have these ego death experiences, that it's really kind of preparing us for the final ego death, which, ego deaths in the context that we hear about with psychedelics is really like, there's some part of your identity that's really holding you back and preventing you from growing. And that part of you needs to die in order for you to go through. And when you're on a psychedelic, it can literally feel like you're physically dying, which is why it's important to have a sober sitter with you, to just have that touch of reality, be like, you're not dying. It just feels like you're dying. A part of you is dying, and you need to sort of mentally let go of that part of yourself. And it can be hard. I went through this myself. Part of my identity, I used to be married to somebody else over 10 years ago. And that was a big ego death for me, was to get rid of that identity as being this person's wife. And in the psychedelic experience where that was coming up, it felt like I had to make a decision, either do this or you will actually die, kind of a thing. So it can be hard and scary and uncomfortable, but it helps us prepare to get better at dealing with moving on and letting go of things that no longer serve us. And eventually that thing will be our physical form. And we're going to have to just transition on to the next phase. And that ego death will be an actual death. And so just interesting to think about philosophically, scientifically, experientially, spiritually. But yeah, that was a lot to cover. Psychedelics, I don't think, are something that should only be kept within the medical scientific realm. There's a huge spiritual component there. Anyone that's had these big experiences probably understands and has engaged with the spirit realm. So I would just say, please have respect for psychedelics and the experiences, and trust your own mind to get you through these things, and hopefully also find yourself a sober sitter if you're going to have one of these big experiences. All right, let's dive into some of the legal realities about psychedelic medicines. So, everyone should know that all the psychedelics that you're hearing about are illegal at the federal level. So, they are Schedule 1 drugs of the Controlled Substances Act, meaning that they have no proven medical use, a high potential for abuse, and basically are just considered the most dangerous class of drugs and need to be highly regulated and controlled. And the only way to get something off Schedule 1 is to have the federal government provide a recommendation to the Drug Enforcement Agency. So the kind of medical wing of our government has to tell the law enforcement wing that these things have medical value and shouldn't be so tightly enforced. And that happens through clinical trials or religious exemptions in very, very select cases, which is what I want to touch upon as well. And yeah, and so it's kind of an interesting space where you have kind of this law enforcement branch of the government having some kind of control over the things that we use as medicine. And then another federal agency that's regulating what we can call medicine in terms of being able to treat it and cover it with insurance and things like that. So, so let's dive into what that means. So basically, the Controlled Substances Act was initiated in 1970 by President Richard Nixon, kind of on the heels of the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War, and there was a lot of stuff going on where, there was like the Summer of Love, so there was a bunch of people taking psychedelics and protesting the war in Vietnam. At the same time, you had the whole civil rights movement happening, people protesting in the streets, and both of those communities were exercising their First Amendment rights to protest these things that they weren't happy with the government, which cannot be, you can't arrest people for exercising their First Amendment right. So what is now known is that the administration at the time, the Nixon administration, recognized that the hippies were doing LSD and mushrooms and mescaline and all that stuff. And the civil rights movements was like smoking cannabis and doing heroin and things like that. So they're like, let's make all these things very illegal so we can now arrest them and throw them in jail for drugs. And then that quenches them being out in the street protesting and being disruptive to society. And thus we get the birth of the Controlled Substances Act and the war on drugs. And this has sort of evolved throughout the years, and they've just kept adding more and more things onto the Controlled Substances Act. There are 5 categories or schedules of drugs on the Controlled Substances Act, ranging from Schedule 1 to Schedule 5, with Schedule 1 being the most illegal and Schedule 5 being the least illegal, or things that are just very, very non-harmful. They have some therapeutic use, but you might need a prescription for them. And then if something is descheduled or exempted from the Controlled Substances Act, then it doesn't have all those restrictions. And so things that have been exempted from the Controlled Substances Act are things like alcohol and tobacco. And I think this is something where, as a society, we've just accepted that these are things that we know are habit forming, they're dangerous, and they don't really have any medical value, but people want them. Like, we tried prohibition with alcohol in the early 1900s, and it didn't go so well. The people rose up and demanded, access to alcohol. And I think we're seeing similar things now with cannabis. Maybe not as violently as things were happening back then, but I think we learned that prohibition of certain things that the public really wants doesn't work. So there is a route to deschedule things, but right now there's a lot of things that are scheduled. So most of the drugs that you get are going to be like from your doctor. If you get prescribed opiates, for example, you need painkillers. That's probably going to be on Schedule 2, where you have things like ketamine, which is a surgical anesthetic. Historically, it's now being used to treat depression and other mental health disorders. That one's a Schedule 3. Things like, Valium anti-anxiety medications, those are on Schedule 4, even though we know that they are very habit-forming and have a higher potential for abuse than we originally thought, which kind of begs the question that maybe there needs to be a reevaluation of the drugs on these different schedules, given that there are so many things on Schedule 1, and it's basically like a regulatory black hole. Once it's on Schedule 1, it's like a death sentence. It takes, as the current laws are written, in order to mandate a rescheduling of something, it has to go through the whole pipeline of drug development, clinical trials, and then approval by the federal government and their rigorous litmus test to say this has medical value, and we're going to allow a company to produce it and insurance companies to pay for its use in certain medical conditions. So that's a really high bar to achieve, and I don't think anything's been taken off Schedule 1 once it's been put on Schedule 1, with the exception of a few components and like ingredients in cannabis, like CBD and synthetic THC. So these are things that are used to treat a variety of neurological conditions, or to help people that are undergoing chemotherapy if they have cancer, to give them more of an appetite, the munchies as a therapy kind of thing. So there are versions of these controlled substances like cannabis that have been rescheduled through research and understanding what conditions they might be helpful for, but the whole plant itself of cannabis still remains on Schedule 1. And so that's something that's called bifurcated scheduling. I won't get into it, but it's where you kind of have this confusing thing where there's a drug product that exists that a pharmaceutical company developed that's derived from this natural source. And the drug product is legal and marketable, and the source material, the plant itself, is highly illegal and dangerous, which is really silly, but that's the basic gist of it. And so we're kind of seeing something similar with magic mushrooms and things like ayahuasca. They have controlled substances in them. So while ayahuasca, or rather DMT, which is a psychoactive component in ayahuasca, those plants are illegal because they have Schedule 1 drugs. Some plants that have Schedule 1 drugs, like, you can have them for ornamental reasons, like certain cacti, even though they have mescaline in them, but then it would be illegal to eat them or consume them or process them in any way. So any kind of extraction that you're going to do from the plant material would be considered kind of like you're now manufacturing or producing, a controlled substance. So it's kind of a weird situation, and there's some kind of gray areas there. Like, for example, New Mexico has allowed people to grow mushrooms in their own house. They can't share them with people, but they've been allowed to grow mushrooms since 2005, and it's just kind of just been happening, and no one's really made a big deal out of it, and I don't think we've heard anything terrible happening in New Mexico. And now we have different states popping up, with Oregon and Colorado being the most notable, where through voter-initiated kind of ballot measures, the citizens of those two states voted to create legal programs to access different psychedelic medicines. So in Oregon, they have psilocybin service centers now that people can go to. They're legal in the state, but they're still federally illegal. So it creates a kind of tricky dynamic of trying to do something within a state that ultimately is a federal crime. But we've been doing this kind of nationally with cannabis. So it's kind of an interesting experiment to see if that kind of federal looking the other way will extend to psychedelics, because they are still Schedule I drugs. So there are state programs that have this. There's going to be a ballot measure in November in Massachusetts where they're going to vote to see if they can create another state program. And then there's actually a lot of different states that are kind of looking at this and having either their legislatures, discuss bills coming through and whether they want to sign anything into law, with the only state so far doing that being Utah. And then other states creating more what are called like working groups. The Psychedelic Medicine Task Force in Minnesota is one of these working groups where the legislature kind of creates this group to really thoroughly research how could something like this be done? How could we create it in a really equitable way? And how can we do it in a way that's not going to piss off the federal government, knowing that giving people these drugs is a federal crime outside the context of, one of these clinical trials that is kind of the current pipeline for taking something from Schedule I into a different schedule where now we can use it as a medicine legally and medically. So it's just kind of interesting to think about, and this is really notable because a lot of people were really excited about MDMA for PTSD being able to complete this gauntlet of federal approval in order to get it rescheduled so people could have access to it legally in a medical setting. So MDMA for PTSD was actually being used quite a bit in the late 70s and early 1980s. By therapists at the time. It wasn't scheduled, and people were seeing its value as something to help people with conditions like PTSD and relationship issues, and there was a lot of excitement about it. And when the DEA kind of discovered that people were using it and it was kind of being used in the underground in these like rave settings, they became concerned, and they did this whole investigation about, its accepted medical use, its abuse potential, and this sort of test that they have when a new substance is kind of ringing some alarm bells, and they're like, oh, let's evaluate it, and they put it through this whole process to see which schedule should it be on. And at the time, most of the evidence and even the lawyers that worked at the DEA were saying, based on all the evidence that came in from this test that you had us do, it should be on Schedule 3. And administratively, the DEA just said, no, we're going to put it on Schedule 1. And that kind of pissed off a lot of people, and that's when MAPS was formed, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. So Rick Doblin, who he was hoping to become an MDMA therapist at the time, and then basically that was shut down because now the medicine that he was hoping to use in practice wasn't available, and it was a Schedule I drug, and now they would have to be a drug dealer in order to do that. So he founded MAPS, and he just went on this long 40-year journey of trying to follow the rules and do what the federal government wants, to say, look, we were already using it for this purpose. You made us stop. We'll show you through your own system how it's useful, and then hopefully you'll let us use it again for what we were already doing it before you got up in our business and told us to stop doing it. Anyway, it's a really silly, frustrating, and just wasteful wasteful process and system from my perspective. So apologies for my crassness and kind of talking about that situation, but it's really frustrating because ultimately MAPS and, they started a public benefit corporation called MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, which wasn't a pharmaceutical company. So they had to seek investors at some point when they realized that they probably couldn't take it to market with the current funding that they had. And, most pharmaceutical companies have tons of money. And so they really needed that infusion of cash to get it over the finish line. And unfortunately, FDA said no. And I won't get into the politics of how that went down and kind of some of the frustrations, but, it's hard to be the first. And the FDA was changing the rules as they were conducting their phase 3 trial. And it was just a really bizarre thing to kind of watch unfold. And ultimately, I think we have a little bit better guidelines on how to do clinical trials with psychedelics, but unfortunately, MAPS et al., and their extended family with kind of the byproducts of Lycos and all of that, trying to get it over the finish line, they're almost like the sacrificial lamb in trying to figure out how can you actually shove psychedelics through this regulatory pipeline that strips it of all of its beauty and potential just to demonstrate something that people already know. I mean, I think it's rare that you have a recreational drug have to kind of go through this whole litmus test. Usually clinical trials are designed to test completely novel drugs or repurposing existing drugs that have already been approved, versus trying to demonstrate how something that's already widely used works. When you have so much history and anecdote and knowledge about this from so many different cultures and contexts, and yet you have this one entity that says, no, you have to shove it through this system to prove to us what you know, because we just can't trust you and everything that you know. So anyway, it's a frustrating system. So there's ways around it. So I mentioned earlier the kind of religious use and religious exemptions with psychedelics. And so that is a pathway that I want to talk about, because there is obviously, I've mentioned First Amendment rights and the First Amendment right of freedom of religion and sincere religious use with a sacrament that has psychedelic properties. So the most notable case that exists in the United States is that of peyote with the Native American Church. So, Native Americans use peyote as their religious sacrament, and it was actually something that the U.S. government intentionally tried to breed out of them and kind of erase through cultural genocide. Is a whole other topic we can get into. But basically stripped them of their culture, of their religious practices, of their language, of their connections to their family and their history. And then, people started to realize, that like there was a very powerful religious component and like kind of the hypocrisy that you have a country founded on freedom of religion, and yet you're oppressing the religion of the people whose land you took to create this country. And so, I mean, I wasn't around when all that was going down, but like, and just looking at the history of how what's called the Religious Freedom and Restoration Act, which basically codified that the Native American Church could use peyote for sincere religious practice, and they had to get an exemption from the DEA in order to do that, but they are allowed to grow and share peyote, which contains mescaline, which is a Schedule I drug, for their religious practice. And so, like, there's been a lot of different acts. I won't get into it. That kind of came secondary to something called AIRFA, which is the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, where like previous types of ceremonies like sun dances were also made illegal. So first they had to kind of make sure they could protect their ceremonies and practices and then their sacrament. But that didn't happen until 1993 was when RFRA was passed. And so so that kind of set a precedent that, oh, there can be religious exemptions if there's like a sincere religious use of a psychedelic, and that the government's kind of compelling interest to enforce the Controlled Substances Act is interfering with someone's First Amendment right and RFRA right to engage in their religious practice. And so there's been only four, I'm going to repeat this, 4 churches in the United States that are legally allowed to give their parishioners psychedelic drugs. And it's only for 2 medicines. One is peyote and the other is ayahuasca. So one of those churches is the Native American Church. Another church is the Santo Daime. And then there's also the UDV. Those 2 churches are from South America, primarily Brazil. And then there was most recently this past year, the Church of the Eagle and the Condor, which is also an ayahuasca church. So that's it. And those have happened by explicitly requesting a religious exemption to use those sacraments for their religion. There are a lot of churches popping up claiming to be able to legally give people psychedelic medicines as sacraments under the Religious Freedom and Restoration Act and under the First Amendment. But unless they explicitly have an exemption from the DEA, that is not legal. Religious freedom is legally protected, but there's another issue here that is a compelling government interest around the Controlled Substances Act. And there's a lot of churches popping up that are sort of diminishing what this right is by using it as a way to subvert the Controlled Substances Act. And I'm not saying that all these churches are doing that, but there are some. And I think I just want people to be careful when they're engaging with any of these churches and just really understand that you are not legally protected unless they have an explicit exemption from the DEA. And if they tell you otherwise, I would be really concerned because that's not true and you are at legal risk. I'm not a lawyer. I cannot give legal advice, but I've been having to do a lot of legal research for the Psychedelic Medicine Task Force to figure out how we can keep our state out of conflict with federal law, including all the people that live within the state. And I also had the benefit of getting certified by Harvard Law School for this 0L course that they teach as part of a psychedelic boot camp that I was able to attend over the summer. So I'm not a lawyer, but I know a little bit about the law, and I've been consulting with lawyers and talking specifically about this issue of religious freedom, and just buyer beware, parishioner beware. It's not legal. It's a legally protected practice, but you have to fight that in court. So the way that these things happen is you can be exercising your religious practice, and that doesn't mean that some law enforcement entity won't come and try to prosecute that or enforce the Controlled Substances Act or slap someone with a diversion or some kind of drug possession charge or drug trafficking charge. And then it's up to the people that are, trying to demonstrate their religious beliefs to then take that up in court and fight in court for your religious rights. And it's an unfortunate process, but that's how it's done. And it's not just something that's given to you. You have to fight for it in order to get it. And so I just want people to be aware of that. I think those cases have a good chance of winning, but it could cost people thousands of dollars to have to go to court over that and potentially losing jobs and custody of children and who knows what. It's just something I want to make sure people understand. These are illegal drugs. There is a war on drugs happening. There is a massive effort to crack down on drug use and drug trafficking and drug diversion. And there's a lot of interest in psychedelics, but there's also a lot of mistrust of drugs and things that, people tend to trust when an authority figure tells them that this is dangerous. This is a Schedule 1 drug. It's dangerous. So I just think we need to kind of take a step back and ground ourselves in the reality of what is legal. I will say that Minneapolis has deprioritized enforcement of use and sharing of specific entheogenic plants. The mayor of Minneapolis signed an executive order in July of 2023. So it's deprioritized. That doesn't mean it's legal. It just means that there's a directive from the mayor that law enforcement aren't allowed to use any more resources to kind of go after people. But that doesn't mean that the sheriff won't, or some state jurisdiction will come in, so it's a gray area. And it's something I'm hoping that we can fix and create a safer, more equitable, accessible environment here in Minnesota with the task force, and hopefully any legislation that might come through. But I just want people to understand what's legal, what's possible, and just kind of what's safe and what's appropriate, and I just want people to be informed of how to engage in the community safely. Thanks. All right, so now I want to talk about a little bit of aspects of harm reduction in the psychedelic space and activism, and how the two can work together to help people engage with psychedelics safely. So when I talk about harm reduction, this term is often used when kind of talking about how to engage with people who use drugs, and not necessarily like prohibiting or criminalizing the behavior, but creating a safety net around use, knowing that people are going to use, and making sure that people can use safely, and reducing harms that they might encounter, whether it be interactions with law enforcement, or issues with housing or childcare, or safe supply or safe consumption sites, or things like that. So when it comes to psychedelics, there's a lot of things to consider around harm reduction. And while psychedelics are pretty safe physically, they do cause a lot of psychological distress and anxiety, and a quote unquote bad trip or challenging experiences, they're more commonly referred to, can be very, very scary. And it's really important to have an understanding of and an expectation of that, and knowing that there could be some scary moments and feelings of being out of control. And that's why it's really important when people talk about this notion of set and setting when it comes to psychedelics, because those challenging, difficult parts of a psychedelic experience are usually the ones that are the most transformative and healing, because they're bringing up some pretty intense material that is buried in all of our subconsciouses. Like things just kind of build up in our minds over time, and it kind of manifests itself in the psychedelic experience, and can sometimes play out as your worst fears, and that can be really scary. And it's really important to, one, have an understanding of that, and two, have somebody with you that can kind of be there to help you process what's happening, and keep you in touch with what's going on, and making sure that, like, if you're scared and feel like you're dying, they can reassure you that you're not. And so that gets at the setting as well. So set and setting refers to the mindset. So what's going on in the person's mind, how prepared are they, how much do they know about what they're going to do, what's going on with them that day, did they get enough sleep, are they going through something very difficult, things like that. Are they on any medications that might interact negatively with the psychedelic they're about to take? So those are all things that are kind of related to the person that's taking it, and what's going on with them and their status and their set, their mindset. And then the setting is really related to like the physical space with which you're going to do a psychedelic experience. And so usually being in a comfortable room that's, not in a busy area where you're going to be encountering a lot of people, trying to minimize loud noises that might come in and out of the room, like fire alarms or other types of things that could be loud or disruptive or scary. and ensuring that whoever's with that person, that's going to be their sitter or facilitator, really understands what they're doing, and they've communicated boundaries and understand safety and what the person's actually consenting to do, and have, at the very least, have those kinds of things. And then there's kind of more things around appropriate ways to facilitate a psychedelic experience, which I can get into at some point in a different talk, or a different video. But basically having somebody there so that the setting, the physical location where the experience is happening, is safe, and the person that's having the experience trusts where they are, who they're with, and whether their mind and body and spirit is prepared to undergo this big experience. And so with those in place, one of these really intense, challenging experiences could be potentially transforming and life-changing and very healing. It could also be very scary and traumatizing if not handled well. So that's a lot of what we talk about in the psychedelic space around harm reduction, is really around what's going on during the experience, as well as noticing and paying attention to, what's going on after an experience. And so in the days and weeks after an experience, given, what I've already talked about with how the brain's kind of in this malleable, changeable state, it's a good opportunity to take that time to rest and process the experience. And also, folks might be a little bit more sensitive to light or sound. People's brains might be a little fatigued. These experiences use up a lot of energy. So, headaches are common, a little bit of irritability. Sometimes people feel a little worse before they feel better. And, I think it's just important to be patient and give ourselves grace in that kind of after period. But also recognizing that not everybody can do that. And sometimes, even though somebody might be able to have access to a big, beautiful, facilitated psychedelic experience, they might be returning to a setting at home or in some other place that they have to go to regularly that is a potential source of distress and trauma. And so it's difficult because people can't just uproot their lives. And so I think, while psychedelics can help show people what they need to change, it doesn't fix the larger societal problems that cause all of our trauma and distress and complications and dis-ease. So it's one part of the problem. It doesn't fix the whole thing. But I think it can at least give people an opportunity to get a temporary break from that and see what's possible. And I think getting into transitioning into activism, this is where I think a lot of people can do their part to speak up about psychedelics and speak up about the war on drugs and try to create a system that is more safe and permissible for people who use drugs. And I don't necessarily want to say that psychedelics are better than anything else. A lot of people use a lot of different substances for different reasons, and that's their right and their kind of cognitive liberty. Some people might have mystical experiences on heroin, and who are we to judge? And so I think it's important to really see what the harms are of the war on drugs and the Controlled Substances Act, and collectively do our part to try and dismantle those harms that kind of come from a system that creates violence and an underground market that, is hard to hold people accountable for, committing violations against each other when they're all doing criminal activity. So, I think doing our part to decriminalize, drug use and possession, and decriminalizing community use, and potentially legalizing and regulating it so that it's above ground, it's in the light, it's in a space where people can be trained, people can be educated, people can be held accountable for wrongdoing, because it's out in the open and people don't have to hide every aspect of their engagement with this aspect of our culture and our society. And so, I've been doing my part in this for a long time. I thought doing science and doing clinical trials and trying to kind of prove through the credible accredited systems in our country to show and demonstrate that psychedelics have value. They have therapeutic value. They have value as a research tool to help us understand how the brain works. They help with, spiritual practice. There's just so many things that psychedelics can be used for. But I've been seeing the limitations of how much policy and regulations and law is actually influenced by science. And it is to an extent, but it is not the most powerful driver of what actually changes laws and policies. It's more of like the will of the people and what are governments willing to allow, based on how much the people demand something. I think in an earlier version I was talking about, we don't have alcohol on the controlled substances list, even though it is profoundly addictive and harmful, because the people demand it, they want it, and prohibition of alcohol didn't work. So there's certain things that we just accept, and we create safety nets around that through our collective work with the community, trying to make sure that, people are not abusing others under the influence of these substances. They aren't selling things to people that aren't what they say they are. They aren't trying to perform things under some license that they don't have or some lineage they're not from. There's just all these things that I think people can do to help create a safer environment and culture and government that allows for people to use things that make them feel good and help them connect with their family and their friends and their spirituality and their health. And so, my main part of doing that is, having the Psychedelic Society, so that there's a community of people that know that they can rely on each other around psychedelics. And then, doing activism around drug policy. Some folks from the Psychedelic Society, started working on efforts with Minneapolis City Council in 2019 towards the eventual deprioritization in Minneapolis that finally happened in 2023, so that there wouldn't be criminal penalties around or enforcement of criminalizing people who are using certain entheogenic plants. And for those that don't know, entheogens is another term for like the naturally derived psychedelics like magic mushrooms and peyote and ayahuasca. And then the more recent thing that personally I'm doing, and that others in different states are doing, is trying to figure out at a state level, because even though we have, deprioritization in Minneapolis, that doesn't make it legal. It's still illegal at the state level, county, state, and federally. So the task force is something I felt compelled to get involved with, even though it's a volunteer gig, to try to create a legal program here in Minnesota so that we can bring all of this above ground and do it in a way that's safe and in a way that's legal, and hopefully in a way that helps heal people from all the reasons why people are trying to access psychedelics. So that involves a lot of just, relationship building and trying to get to know politicians and lawmakers and understanding the legal realities of this, understanding the politics of it, understanding the what's happening in other states, and how do law enforcement feel about this? How do doctors feel about this? It's a big gnarly issue. But I would argue that psychedelics, especially psychedelics like magic mushrooms, like they're easy to grow, they're pretty safe. They do induce really intense experiences, but people have been using them for a really long time. We know how to manage these experiences and help people through, even if Western medicine doesn't, or law enforcement doesn't know how to handle somebody when they come across somebody tripping on LSD or mushrooms. So a big piece of activism and harm reduction, I think, is also education, which is what I'm trying to do, is educate the public about psychedelics and the law and what policy shifts are happening here and in other states. And, really trying to, see if we can educate and convince the lawmakers and the legislators and the state agencies and the people that manage all of the services that we rely on as citizens of this state. I think having good relationships and talking with these people and having ongoing conversations about how to help provide access and do it in a way that's safe. And so I encourage folks to, get involved, learn about what's going on in the Psychedelic Society. You can also follow what's going on with the Psychedelic Medicine Task Force here in Minnesota. And hopefully, we're wrapping up that work. We're going to be done towards the end of, November. We should be done writing our report. We're basically a working group creating a report for the legislature should a bill come through to, create a medical program or decriminalize things. This report that we're working on, that we've been working on for about a year now, will hopefully inform anything that comes through. And it's been worked on and consulted with very smart lawyers and researchers and policymakers and people at federal agencies and regulators in Oregon and Colorado, and tribal consultation. We've tried to be as comprehensive as we can be given the limited time we've had and the lack of resources to kind of really solicit subject matter experts and pay them. So I won't get into the details of how the task force has been running, but I've been fortunate enough to chair the task force. Everything I say is my own opinion. I don't speak for the task force, but as a member of the task force and somebody really interested in making this a reality here in Minnesota, I'm excited about our work, and hopefully our report that we submit to the legislature proves useful and can help any bills that move through pass, and that those politicians that are going to be discussing any bills about psychedelics will find this report useful and informative, and hopefully it will help it pass so we can have legal psychedelics here in Minnesota. All right. Well, thanks for listening. And we'll do these updates every quarter. So stay tuned, and feel free to send an email out to the Psychedelic Society of Minnesota, psychedelicmn@gmail.com. And thank you for your support and attention.